Because you've always taken such charge.
You are listening
to the Border Chronicle.
Welcome to the Border Chronicle podcast, where we bring news and analysis from the border. I'm Caroline Tracey, a reporter and editor with the Border Chronicle, as well as the author of Salt Lakes and Unnatural History. Today, we have a conversation with Alex González Ormerod, who is the editor of the Mexico Political Economist and the author of the 2025 book La derecha no existe, pero ahí está, Guía para entender su fracaso y su futuro en México, which means the right doesn't exist, but it's there, a guide for understanding its failure and its future in Mexico. The book is in part a history of the failure of past right-wing efforts, and in part an argument for why a recovery of the right would be beneficial for the country's democracy. Alex argues that this is important even for those who consider themselves staunchly of the left. In this podcast, I speak with Alex about the history of the PAN Party, including its odd and sometimes unhappy marriage of Catholics and businessmen, and about his arguments regarding the future of democracy in Mexico. Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your book, and I am going to say that I am not embarrassed to say this because it's nice to always be learning, but there were words that I looked up in Spanish that I was like, I've never seen that English word. Side reel or relating to distant stars. I didn't know that word.
Oh yes, sideral. Sideral, sidereal.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, in
I know, I looked it
sideral.
up. And
Yeah.
hemiplegia. I had never heard that word.
Yeah, although hemiplegia, like that quote is just deliberately, I love that quote because it's an interesting perspective, right? It's literally the perspective on which the whole book is based on, which is this great Spanish intellectual saying, if you say you're left-wing or right-wing, you're actually an idiot. But he says it in such a pedantic way.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's his mode. He's always like,
Yeah.
just shooting from the hip as a pedant.
Well done.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Ultimately, what I'm keen to hear is whether you enjoyed the beginning, because as a first-time author, obviously what one needs to do is make the first chapter almost indecipherable for certain people. So I want to hear what you thought.
Yeah, I mean, well, you should explain to the listeners what the first chapter is, but I will say I was disoriented for a few pages, and then I was like, wait, is this fiction? Is this speculative fiction?
Yes. I mean, it was something that the editors were very keen on, which I was surprised about. Siglo XXI, the publishing house that published this book, is a very, very well-known and established publishing house. They're serious in the sense that they're a serious publishing house, but they were sort of flexible enough to say, yeah, why don't you have fun with this? And basically, this happened accidentally. If you realize, every section of the book is a different genre. Like, the first one is fiction. It's a what if. Second chapter is an essay. Third chapter is a sort of more historical approach. And then the final chapter is journalism. Mm-hmm. And it's the first one is really quite mean, but I enjoy it because my big critique of Mexican authors generally is that they think their readers are idiots, and so they over-explain. And it's like, come on, man. Like, I always tell this joke, ruined by Mexicans when they tell it. I think it was Octavio Paz who told it, because it makes me so angry, because it's so obvious that the punchline was there, and then they over-explain it. It's the Winston Churchill being told by this woman, Winston, you're drunk. And he says, and you, madam, I may be drunk, but you, madam, are ugly. And then there's a pause, and then they explain, and that's because he's going to be sober later and she's going to be ugly forever, and like you're like, come on, man, it's like and so I've done the opposite.
Let people figure it out.
Yeah, I've done the opposite which is not announce that it's fiction and just kick it off as if I'm writing about, like, as if it's a sort of piece of historical journalism on what was happening.
How we got to the Mexico of today, which is the alternate reality Mexico of today.
Exactly. And I sort of love the idea. This is me stealing from Dominic Sandbrook book from Rest is History, but he's got a very nice opinion on what ifs, which is historians should never really do what ifs, but it's a wonderful genre to explore things that wouldn't have changed, like structural forces that never would have changed no matter what would have happened.
Right. And I mean, I think one of the things that's sort of interesting about history, like when you study history and how to write history, is that it's sort of like finding all the different points of contingency. And so you kind of are proving to the reader that all of this was contingent right from the start.
Exactly right. Because that's one of the questions that a sort of unprofessional approach to this was, I always ask myself, is Mexico behind or ahead of the rest of Latin America? Because we've had the pink wave come washing over Latin America. Before that, we had the sort of democracy wave coming over Latin America in the 80s and 90s. And Mexico always felt like it was behind. And so if you subscribe to that idea, Mexico will get a right-wing president in a few years' time, because that's what's happened across Latin America. But then again, as one should never do, you should never anthropomorphize countries and historical and social processes. So really, Mexico is just Mexico, and that's kind of the point. Like, that's the only thing we can really say, which is really unsatisfactory, but also a very good place to start, because it allows you to say, well, why is Mexico just, or why is Mexico Mexico? And the answer is, well, all this historical baggage that it carries, which is chapter 2 or 3.
Right. Well, maybe that's sort of a place to ask you my first question for you, which is, as you mentioned, this book has multiple genres in it, but part of it is kind of a history of the Mexican right, and part of it is, you call it a guide for constructing a future right. Yeah. I'm curious, what inspired you to write it in the first place?
So there's a sort of simple answer, which is the publishing house was jealous of the Argentinian branch, because the Argentinian branch of Siglo XXI is incredibly good, and they do really, really good current affairs books. And a new editor, my editor, Rocío Martínez, came to power in Siglo XXI in Mexico, and she was convinced that she wanted to do a Mexican side. So really, she read a piece that I'd published in English in the Mexico Political Economist, which is my day job. I run a publication that covers Mexican politics and economics in English for a mostly American audience, but an international audience. And I'd written a piece called Where the Right Went Wrong. And it's me talking to former bigwigs, at least Margarita Zavala, interesting people from that era. And they read that piece and they enjoyed it, because I think with a lot of foresight, they said this might become relevant someday. And what was crazy to us at the time was, this is just a year ago, we said, well, who knows if this will be relevant? Who's going to want to read the book about the Mexican right if it doesn't exist, right? And of course, lo and behold, about a year and a half later, there start to be a few green shoots coming out from that seemingly barren wasteland in unexpected places as well, which I think is an interesting thing to see, because some things weren't at all even mentioned in the book, which happened in the past few months, like the Partido Vida, which literally nobody knew about until they became an official party, which in Mexico is incredibly difficult. All the the wannabe parties that were trying to get registered that I cover in the book, I said in the book, they don't seem like they're going to get there because of X and Y and like all of these different limitations that they've got. But yeah, I mean, and the reason I wrote that initial piece was because it was frustrating to me to hear the narrative from the right and the opposition generally in Mexico. I've got a phrase that I tell everyone, which is there is only one thing that is worse than the Mexican government, and it's the Mexican opposition. They're just so inept and so bad at their jobs, which I find very frustrating because, and this is me quoting a sort of far left figure in Mexican politics, Gerardo Fernández Noroña, and he said when Morena completely ravaged the opposition in the elections and got a supermajority, he said, all right, well, we've got power, we've got everything we need, but we also kind of need you guys, i.e. the opposition, because otherwise Mexican democracy doesn't work, right? So I've taken him at his word, and even if you're not right-wing, I make an argument that it is valuable, number one, to identify these specific ideological categories, and we can talk about why I believe that. And then secondly, once you've identified each other, to actually put them into place in the Mexican, state apparatus and Mexican government, not ruling necessarily, but sort of as counterbalances to what is meant to be a left-wing party. And I say meant to be a left-wing party, and why I think it's important even for left-wing people to want a right-wing party is if there's no avenue for people with ideological differences to aspire to power, they'll just go to the place where power is concentrated anyway. And so you've started to see the encroachment of very, very reactionary figures within the supposedly left-wing party.
Yeah, that was my second question for you, that I think that most of our listenership at the Border Chronicle would identify with the left wing, and so, what's the sort of reason for a support for a right wing kind of resurgence for people who, either support the existing left or feel like it's not far left enough?
I think about this in the way that I think about the American tourists in Mexico City, which is they've completely taken over La Colonia Roma and Condesa, these two neighborhoods. I'd rather they just stay there, actually, and we can just keep cramming them in there, and then just keep the rest of Mexico City free of digital nomads cluttering up our cafes. I actually love the American tourists that come here, but the one thing that I hate is that they've forced me to have to reserve at restaurants a week before, and that never used to be the case. But anyway, the same logic applies, I think, to Mexican politics, which is, one should always want, in democracy that is, one should always want clear definitions in politics so that, number one, you can identify them, even if you're not really into politics. But number two, once you've identified each other, you can go with your people and sort of create at least internally coherent projects for government, right? I think I am more or less, I think I could say that I'm aligned with the readership of your readership. But I insist that people from the left should want right-wing parties to be healthy enough to provide counterweights, because there's nothing worse than a party that stays in power forever. There's a sort of big section in the book where we talk about how the PRI is very much a left-wing political party until it isn't, because there's no one to hold back the interests, business interests, religious interests, etc., US interests, and that's where they see the power lying. We can see it happening in Venezuela today. I think that's a really good example as to how important how important it is to have actual democracy, because what you get when you don't have actual democracy is the powers that be coming in, moving in, forcing you to do the things that they want you to do, even if you're the same people, even.
Right, and everyone kind of just becoming encompassed by the party gradually because there is no other alternative.
Exactly right. And worse still, I'd say, people with actual beliefs and who are aligned to an ideology of the left in Morena, I think, will sometimes disagree with what the party says. Why? Because the party sometimes has to be pragmatic, makes perfect sense. I sometimes support the pragmatism, I sometimes don't. But some people from the left say, this is rubbish, we should definitely oppose this internally. And those people are annoying to the party leadership. Whereas very right-wing people who have been caught off guard in a corruption scandal and now are part of the governing party because they're very useful, because they've got party machineries at home in the sort of district, and so they can sort of mobilize people there, and then are also very, very reliable when you need them to vote a certain way, whatever it is. Suddenly you get a system where it's actually far more convenient for the party leadership to have the far right person who is subservient to you than an independently minded left-wing person.
Yeah, that's a great point. Can you tell us about the PAN? I think it was interesting. Well, I feel like I've heard, many different assessments and sometimes misconceptions of the PAN from American sort of onlookers to Mexico, but it was really interesting for me to read about how you talk about how they sort of combine this kind of Catholic moral side, then the business community gets involved later, but then also there's like support for sort of socialist style redistribution programs.
Yeah, I mean the Tony Blairs and Bill Clintons of the 1940s even, they were very much opposed to this minimalistic idea of capitalism versus socialism. They actually didn't like either, which I think is interesting. They were very much concerned with a third way that we now really recognize after the 1990s, which is a third way of civil society and of just, like people and organizations coming together to govern the country. And that works if you're a sort of right-wing liberal, because actually it means that the state shouldn't really get in the way, because really you've got charities, companies, and, well-meaning people, well-meaning citizens doing what's right to run as much as they can, and then the state comes in when you absolutely need it to. So that's where it's a right-wing conception of this sort of nice like kumbaya movement. But I think it's fascinating because the PAN is an old party, so obviously it's gone through a bunch of evolution. But what I think is particularly interesting is the fact that it was born not as a right-wing party, but simply as a party that was completely disgusted with how the Mexican Revolution had gone under what became the PRI, which was now, by that point, pretty clearly a one-party state. And what Gómez Morín, the founder, the intellectual founder of the PAN, said, they're actually not abiding by the new constitution that we signed in 1917. And that constitution was pretty socialist. So this is a legalistic approach. He's not actually ideological at all, to a certain extent. He's ideological to the extent that he thinks that the letter of the law is maybe, sort of the spirit of the law is not being abided by. And so that, I think, is really interesting, because the right-wingness comes much later, when you get people reacting to the socialism of the PRI, specifically around education, which I think is interesting. People don't tend to think of educational issues as a big mobilizing point, but it really was. And that's why you end up with the Catholic Church, certain academics, certain lawyers, and certain business people in this early PAN. But it wasn't religious, it wasn't right-wing at all, but they became anti-socialist. And so that's when they start moving, because they were against the party that was in power. And then as time ticks along, a series of events happen. One of those events is the Cuban Revolution, and you can see the FOMO, this weird midlife crisis that the PRI has, because they're no longer the cool kids on the block. They're no longer the proper revolutionaries. They're sort of the old men. They're the status quo. And so they try to align themselves with the Cuban Revolution, mostly to see if they can get some of that magic sort of like dust rubbed off on them. And that really upsets the PAN. And so that's when they become properly right-wing, in opposition to the Cuban Revolution and the Mexican government, which is seemingly aligning with them.
I see. What was so controversial about education? What was the
so there's
thing you were reacting to then?
Your listeners might recognize the name Lázaro Cárdenas, who was the first real left-wing president after the Mexican Revolution, we can say. Big populist that came to power, sweeping reforms, including the expropriation of oil from American and British companies. And a big thing that he had was he was a proper left-wing, socialist, right? What was interesting to me is the most left-wing person that he had in his cabinet was the education secretary. And he was determined to fulfill the letter of the law, ironically. The law from 1917 said, the Constitution said, Mexican education had to be secular, it had to be free, it had to be universal. That's something that still exists today. But it also had to be socialist. And that was in the Mexican Constitution. So this is the socialists coming in to abide by the socialist Constitution. And people just could not believe it. It had insane stuff. I mean, Carolyn, you'll be upset by this. It was pretty radical. It had stuff like, discussion about human rights and sex ed. So, radical and disgusting stuff that I'm glad no one's talking about anymore. Really radical stuff. But of course, this is the 1930s we're talking about. So people were very upset, and obviously the church comes out and says, don't touch, it's the same slogans. Don't mess with my kids and stuff like that. It's just, yeah. Right. But at the time it was very radical. And so ultimately, two things happen here. The first is it creates the PAN, and it also creates enough of a movement against the government for the PRI not to lose, because they were pretty entrenched by then, and they had a good fraud and corporatist machinery to move people the right direction towards them. But it forced Lázaro Cárdenas to choose against this very left-wing candidate, who he would have, secretary, who he would have wanted to have as his candidate, his successor. Logically, he was the ideologically correct choice. And he went for basically the opposite man, a man who is very clearly pragmatic and to a certain extent left-wing. He's the one who has a big rapprochement with the church, and that, I think, is the big importance, I think, even if you don't have a party, which I think people are obsessed with now. If I don't have a party, how can we have an opposition? Actually, you talk to the Poles, you talk to the PAN back then, and you can actually move the needle to a certain extent through this sort of social pressure. Right.
And then, so you write about how the business community decides that they're going to make the PAN their party in the 1980s, is it?
Yes.
How does that happen?
It's a wonderful story in that it sounds like it's like this weird business cabal, except there's minutes that they've published themselves, so it's just out there. And it's the business people getting together in we'll rewind a bit. So the business community in Mexico was part of the corporatist apparatus, right? A really important thing is that the Mexican business community after the revolution is a product of the revolution. So you were an old general and now you make T-shirts or workers' clothes. So you're going to get all the contracts from the government. So you're very linked to the state and to the governing party. So for many, many decades, from the we'll say from the 1930s until the 1970s, there is this very close relationship between the business community and the revolutionary business community, that is, and the Mexican government, the revolutionary government in the PRI. What changes is a couple of things. The first is this economic miracle in Mexico runs out of steam. And so businesses start either running out of business or they start looking for other places. And this is the beginning of Mexico's export economy. And the interesting thing about exports is that you stop depending as much on local domestic factors and you start depending more on foreign factors and you become independent to a certain extent. You're charging in dollars, you're doing a lot of work. And then simultaneously, the third avenue would be to double down on the government. And that's when you get the rise of this sort of more interventionist state, muscular intervention in the economy under Luis Echeverría. This is the 1970s, mid-1970s. And he runs the economy into the ground, not because of the investments, but because of the way that he spent them in unproductive uses. So instead of growing the economy in a productive way, which I think is the best way of doing industrial policy, and has been seen to work all over the world, including today, India and China, which are the two giants in the global economy in terms of growth rates. But the issue back then was that money was being spent to keep people in jobs, to keep companies artificially afloat, and so they just consumed debt, they made bad products. And that's annoyingly as well what most Mexicans think of when they think of government intervention in the economy. So this is an issue to this day. But the big issue was he's a big interventionist. He's very much for the Cuban Revolution, Luis Echeverría, and he says, of course, I love socialism, and we're sort of like this third world bloc, but actually we're just as friendly with the socialists as with the capitalists, and that really upsets the Mexican capitalists. And then so when the Mexican Communist Party kidnaps and murders the main businessman in Mexico from Monterrey, who was the heir, the creator, the founder of what is today still one of Mexico's biggest companies, what happens is the business sector says, screw the government, we don't want to deal with the government anymore. And so they try to start organizing themselves, and what they come across immediately is, oh wow, it's actually very difficult to do anything in Mexican politics because there is no democracy and there's very few avenues to get to power. And so they try it a few times, fail, and then in 1982 they decide, in a hotel at a conference in Ciudad Juárez on the border, where, by the way, a lot of the export industry is starting to develop, is they're going to get together and they say, we need to make a decision. Either start a new party or we take control of an existing vehicle. And that, of course, was the main opposition party at the time, which was the PAN. And so you get the arrival of what they used to call the barbarians from the north, because they were literally Mexican northern industrialists, and they called them the northern barbarians, los bárbaros del norte, and they had crazy things like beards and stuff, very 1970s and 80s for like the state. And it was wonderful for the PAN because it filled it with new blood and money, and that changed the way the PAN worked, because it started not just being a testimonial party, but it became a party that was out there driven by this sort of capitalist bravado to actually win. And they start winning, but of course, almost immediately they start selling out, because what happens in Mexico in the 1980s and 90s is the PRI comes to more or less the same conclusion as the business people, which is, we don't want this sort of state intervention anymore, let's liberalize. And so weirdly, there's this confluence of ideologies from the PAN, which becomes very much neoliberal in the traditional sense of the word, the academic sense of the word, no longer about Catholicism, screw all this social stuff, it's about the economy. And then on the other side, you've got the Mexican government under, namely, Carlos Salinas de Gortari in the late 1980s, 1988, which is where my book begins. That confluence of ideas around neoliberalism occurs in a fascinating way because they start selling out immediately. They start working with the PRI and they actually get along very nicely. And so this is the origin of the split within the PRI that creates the new left, a left that called itself the Democratic Front, but actually also hated the economic approach of the PRI. And among them is people like Lázaro Cárdenas, who runs and loses in 1988. And amongst those people is a young organizer and then party leader called Andrés Manuel López Obrador.
Yeah. And one other beat that I thought was interesting that was you describe in 1992 the group that exits the PAN. Yeah. Because they were, I guess, unhappy with this turn that the party had taken.
Exactly. I mean, go on.
Yeah. Oh, no, you go on, because I just wanted you to tell the listeners a little bit about why they were unhappy and left.
The great fallacy, I think, of the... I mean, we'll see if we're talking about the same one, because the history of the PAN is also a history of expelling the people who no longer fit the criteria that the PAN stands for at that time. The one I'm thinking of is actually a reason there's a whole section in my book about the Catholic Church. Because my editor says, well, it's the PAN, it's the Mexican right, why isn't there a chapter about the church? And my whole thing was, the church is kind of irrelevant. But of course, my editor was right. I did need a chapter to explain why, because this is a weird thing to contemplate. The Mexican Catholic Church has at times tried to intervene in Mexican politics, but after this sort of socialist uprising or anti-socialist uprising in the first half of the 20th century, really you get nothing else because the Catholic Church realizes it's lost this war. And, its more radical elements do come out, but weirdly, the radical elements from the left, and so you get moments in the PAN in the 1960s and 70s where you get this liberation theology vein of the Catholic Church in the PAN, which isn't at the time completely associated with the right at the time, and people are very concerned, especially the business people and the lawyers in the PAN are very concerned about these Catholics who very much seem like people like Pope Leo and Pope Francis, sort of weird lefties in what shouldn't be a left-wing space. And then what you get towards the end of this is people getting kicked out of the PAN because they feel a bit too left-wing and a bit too socially enfocados, focused on social issues. And what's weird and wonderful about that is that they get kicked out of the PAN and loads of them end up in Morena because they were the PAN's left wing. And I think that's fascinating. The man in charge, or the man, we'll see, it seems to be dead in the water, but the man who was in charge of the electoral reform under Claudia Sheinbaum, Pablo Gómez, was one of these people from the PAN back in the day.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, yeah, I in my notes I just had foristas. That's what I had written down.
Exactly.
I think it was Foro Democrático y Doctrinario. That I thought that was just an interesting sort of moment because I think one of the misconceptions or conceptions, maybe it's a misconception in the eye of the beholder, one of the conceptions I hear about the PAN, I think, from U.S. viewers is they're ultra-Catholic and ultra-conservative as a result. And that's, I think, sort of imposing the U.S. sort of Catholic influence on politics onto the Mexican parties, where here it is sort of this anti-abortion campaign that's gone on for decades has affected a really major shift right in U.S. politics. But I think it's a somewhat different situation with regard to the Catholic sort of presence in the PAN.
100%. And what's insane to me is people are always focusing in on the interest of the moment, right? So when the PAN focuses on the economic side of the argument, even the right-wing Catholics kind of get in the way because Catholicism isn't necessarily a capitalist ideology or a pro-capitalist ideology. It does clash. And so Catholicism gets in the way of a lot of the new precepts of the PAN in the 1980s, and also egos do. And so that's how you get people like the far right head of what seems to be a secret Catholic society in the PAN, known as Manuel Espino, getting kicked out because he hadn't won when he wanted to win in the PAN, and having a big tantrum, leaving the PAN, and then many years later now being part of Morena as well. So this is a man who was literally part of a Catholic secret society that's on the far right, who is now in Morena. Why? Because he has a lot of political capital, and he can, and Moreno likes to exploit that.
Maybe this is skipping a couple of questions ahead on my list, but maybe it would be a good moment to ask you about the the chapter you have about Catholicism and its influence in Mexican politics, because I think you're right. It's sort of not maybe what people would expect. It's a sort of, well, you should take it.
This is important to look at historically because religion works differently in Mexico. Mexican religiosity failed in a much more spectacular way than it did in the rest of the continent. That's including the United States and Canada. We had the traditional conflict between conservatives and liberals, as you saw in the rest of Latin America for most of the 19th century. But what happened was the liberals in Mexico won decisively, and that was a rarity because no one quite won decisively. And so, because the Catholic Church was categorically beat, and then the Mexican Revolution comes around, and what you get is liberals against liberals against liberals, and so it's anarchist liberals versus conservative liberals, but they're all liberals, and the main tenet in liberalism is get the church out of the state. The last sort of hurrah of the Catholics in Mexico as a political and military force was with the Cristero War right at the end of the Mexican Revolution in the 1920s, and when they are beat completely, the Catholic Church comes out and says, all right, you know what, we're done. We no longer, we have no more fight in us. Let's just let us be. And the Mexican government said, okay, that's fine. And the Mexican government was pretty repressive against the Catholic Church for a while. Priests weren't allowed to vote. Nuns and priests weren't allowed to wear their habits publicly. It was very much an anti-Catholic. So it was an openly anti-Catholic movement. It wasn't secularist. It was anti-Catholic. And so the years go by, and of course the Catholics join the PAN because that's the anti-PRI party. But again, they can never quite get into power within the PAN until many people thought the year 2000. The year 2000 comes around and the PAN wins the presidency under Vicente Fox. Vicente Fox is a Catholic because most Mexicans are Catholic, per se, right? And he's from a very conservative and very Catholic state, which is Guanajuato. But he's not really a Catholic. Come on, guys. He is a divorcee who was having an affair with his head of campaign during the campaign and had to pull a few favors from the local bishop to get his previous marriage annulled. Like, this man is not a serious... he's as Catholic as, Donald Trump is a very religious man, right? He very much in the same vein. But he was a Catholic in a performative way, right? Like, he didn't care about this division of church and state. Mexican state is very, very careful about never having religious iconography in anything. When he'd say stuff like, thank God, and like very basic things that anywhere else would be like, yeah, whatever, that's just a comment. Whereas in Mexico, a secularist country is very sensitive about that. And so when he arrives to power, a couple of things happen, right? The context of Vicente Fox arriving to power is massive. We can go into it later. But a big part of it is the end of the Cold War, which is the definitive end of the socialist option as an option. And so this is, again, part of why the PRI and the PAN coincide quite a bit, ideologically after the Cold War especially. A big reason why the PAN wins in the year 2000, because it's the end of history. Might as well have the right-wing liberals come into power. But that has an interesting effect elsewhere as well. So it takes the PAN to power, but it also reveals the existence of this secret Catholic society that I was talking about. And it's called El Yunque. What's the name in Spanish? In English?
A yoke? It's like...
or
is it an anvil?
The anvil.
Yeah, the anvil. Yeah.
Which was created in the mid-20th century as an anti-communist shock force. It was literally just young thugs getting together to beat up communists at universities. And they had different local chapters, and they were very sort of secret society-y, because they were hiding from the anti-Catholic atheist Mexican government. And, it's sort of, there's a certain degree of camaraderie in the secret society shtick. The problem is, they're far right, they're definitely very ultra-Catholic, but they're overall, and this is what people really understate, they're very, because it doesn't matter to us anymore, they were very, very anti-communist. That's their raison d'etre. That's why they existed. And so when communism dies in the way that we thought of it with the end of the Soviet bloc, they have a crisis internally, which is what we even exist for. But the thing is, you couldn't reveal you were from the Junke because that would get you tortured by your fellow Junke members. And so that's happening. It's the sort of internal strife of the Junke right as the PAN comes to power. And then in the year 2000, Fox comes to power, and one of the Junke members leaks a bunch of documentation to a left-wing journalist. And it seems to happen at exactly the same time. Too good to be true? I mean, no, not really, because it's very much linked to the end of the Cold War. They both are concurrent events because of this thing. But they're not linked events, because sure, there might have been some Junke people in the PAN, was the Catholic people in the PAN, right? And they got rid of the left-wing Catholics in the 1970s and 80s. But the thing is, the revelation of the existence of the Junke is actually a completely separate thing. And the people who were in power weren't the Catholics. It was the hardcore neoliberals, the barbaros del norte, the businessmen from the north. And the businessmen from the north are famously very pragmatic. They might go to church because their wife or their partner is asking them to go, but really, they just want to make money. And so that's like, it seemed to happen at the same time. And what happens is a massive backlash, especially in places like Mexico City, where the left had its bastion. And what you get is this crazy thing, which is some of the greatest victories of the left happened when we were supposed to be under the yoke of the anvil, of the Junke. But it was the opposite. They had no power. They were completely in disarray. The PAN didn't care for them because they were just about the economic vision of the right. And the left goes really hard on the social issues. And this is when you get things like same-sex marriage in Mexico City. The abortion debate gets pushed ahead decades because of these moments. And what you end up getting is a really pathetic and crumbling Catholic infrastructure on one side, and then on the other side, this sort of triumphant left that is terrified of that Catholic infrastructure because they think it's much bigger than it is, because it must be secret. And
it's like this boogeyman kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you have this like scintillating revelation, and it turns out actually that organization is somewhat irrelevant by the point that it's revealed. Exactly
right. It's such an interesting case study, because people still, it's a bit like Al-Qaeda, funnily enough. Al-Qaeda was a big, important organization, and the United States was actually pretty effective at destroying Al-Qaeda. And yet, to this day, you read the BBC, you read like Western media, and they'll say stuff like Al-Qaeda linked, Al-Qaeda-ish, Al-Qaeda style, because they know the brands in your mind. Al-Qaeda's been kind of irrelevant for a long time now.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating how the brand and the fear of the brand persists.
What about, I think another question that I have about kind of Catholicism in Mexico, which is that you have a country that on one hand is super, super secular. Like, I think that's another sort of conception that people fail to realize about Mexico from the U.S. perspective, is that because we conceive of it as a Catholic country, we fail to understand that it's so, so secular in its sort of rule of law. But then, on the other hand, you have things like Opus Dei is like a real thing in Mexico, whereas here it's just a thing in Dan Brown novels, or like, the Legionarios de Cristo, like that doesn't, as far as I know, really exist in the U.S. Like, why is this sort of this extreme balance of religion, and do those kind of far right Catholic organizations have a political influence?
There are two types of Catholic organization under the PRI, because that's what was allowed to exist under that secular rule. On one side, you had the secret societies that were openly, or rather, sort of contradiction in terms, but I hope to make myself clear. It was a secret society that had to be secret because it was openly political, like internally, right? The Junke had to be secret because it was anti-communist, and the whole thing was political. Los Legionarios de Cristo, very much apolitical, and that's why they're allowed to exist. They exist in the space of education and, Catholic social doctrine and priestly education. The reason they got into politics, of course, is because a lot of the people were educated. The PAN was educated in these schools, and so this isn't Macías Maciel in as a political actor when you were in the PAN. Maciel being this terrible man we'll talk about in a sec, pederast who has now been completely rejected even by the Legionarios de Cristo. But he was a very influential person, not because he was particularly political, but because he was so powerful in social and economic circles. This is the other side, right? Like, the Juncker wasn't powerful. Maybe the Juncker wasn't that relevant. What about Maciel? We all know how terrible he was, and he was so close to Vicente Fox. And the answer is yes, he was, but because he was a corrupt piece of shit. He moved his money and his self-interest to benefit himself. And this is the tragedy of someone like Maciel, a monster who did terrible things to so many children, defended by the Catholic Church for so long, but not because he had any ideology behind him beyond his own self-interest. And I think that's the tragedy, for these the victims of this man, right? He was a monster. Well, sorry, not the tragedy. This is sort of like the tiny bit of silver lining for the victims of this man. He was a monster on a very individualist and individual level who used his organization to benefit himself personally. Had he mobilized his organization for the sort of more Dan Brown nefarious means, I think we'd be in a far bigger trouble.
Right. It's almost like the political influence is incidental because he can be like, well, I just run schools, but it's also, of course, calculated because I think my sort of takeaway from your chapter was like, well, like elite's gonna elite, you know, like they people who want power and they will end up kind of consolidating power through the means they have, which in this case, you know, is schools and other type of organizations that bring people together like that.
And especially if you're part of this business class that hates the government because they got in your business, basically, you will go to these Catholic schools because they're also very good status signifiers. They're expensive. They were very, very expensive to get into. So there were more social clubs than, and this isn't me making it up. It's not prejudice. It's just the truth. Private schools in Mexico don't do much better than public schools, even though public schools are disdained by the rich. They're seen as the worst thing that could ever happen. No rich person, as opposed to the US, where if you get into a good school district, you'll send your kids to public school, even if you're rich. In Mexico, it's the last thing you'd ever do. There's no such thing as a good public school. There's a few public schools that are far better than many of the very, very expensive schools. But the reason that people go there is because they can isolate themselves and their class, their social class, through this barrier of money. And the excuse is the Catholic education. But they don't actually care about the Catholic education. They care about the social club.
Yeah, the networks. Yeah. Maybe we should go back to Vicente Fox and why is it important? You mentioned it's important that he comes to power, but then also I think one of the interesting things about what you write is how he sort of tried to run the government like a corporation and it failed.
Yeah. Vicente Fox gets a lot of attention in my book. And it's weird because Mexico generally, when people think about it in the United States especially, people think of the drug wars. And the drug wars start right after Vicente Fox. Vicente Fox is a far more economic and ideological figure beyond the narcos. And so people sort of think of him as a bit of a dunce. He was gaffe prone. And so people say, well, you know, democracy came with him, but he's sort of someone who can brush over and get to the important stuff, which is the drug war and then the rise of the left. But I the more I read about him, the more interesting it was to me, because what was fascinating about Vicente Fox is that he was the perfect example of the perfect stereotype of a man of his time who was so enmeshed in his ideology that he didn't think he had an ideology. A lot of the stuff that he said was couched in terms that we now really recognize as hardcore right-wing neoliberal terminology: modernity, efficiency, deficit cuts, wasteful government, etc. But to him, that was just good government. And that's what's incredible, because there's no greater ideologue and fanatic than the ideologue that doesn't even recognize he's part of a political and ideological debate. This is just the truth. It's my religion. And so he comes into, and this, by the way, is Vicente Fox's true religion, right? He's a Coca-Cola corporate man. He comes to politics with the business people, and he comes to power with the idea that the big issue with the government is the government. And what you've got to do is get rid of as much of the government as you can, and whatever you have left of the government, you're going to have business people running it. And it's fascinating because at one point, Carlos Slim is saying to Vicente Fox, dude, please chill out with these reforms. You're gonna people are gonna starve in the streets. People need some sort of social safety net. And he's like, shut up. I mean, this is just good government. This isn't ideological. All you critics are just being ideological. And it's a fascinating place to discuss what it means to be right wing in Mexico, because I think a lot of people are still stuck there, especially the old liberals, the people who still used to be in power up until very recently, less than a decade ago. Who ran the magazines, who ran the TV stations, who are very angry with the government today because they call it ideological. And what's interesting to me is ultimately they were very ideological, it's just they're still in denial. They're right-wing, and I think it's fair enough to say you're right-wing. David Cameron said he was right-wing, George Bush said he was right-wing, conservative. It's fine to be conservative, right? We can all disagree, we can have a nice conversation. But that conversation was beyond the pale to some of these liberal ideologues in Mexico, because they didn't see, they really believed the Fukuyama shtick. I hate using Fukuyama because he's become everyone's favorite whipping boy, but he's just so useful. And the fact that people believed him in Mexico, that was the end of history, that the Cold War meant that liberal capitalism was the only actual way to go forward, and therefore the debate was over. We still have people who are part of this Foxista entourage who still believe that, and then say incredible things that I love to point out, like a sort of award-winning and famous essay by a very liberal man called Enrique Krause, great intellectual, great historian, I'd say, very much a man of his time, and very much a right-wing liberal. And what's fascinating about him is that he's got this great essay called Democracy Without Adjectives, which I talk about a lot in the book. And it's just such a good case study because it's a massive book-long essay about how the left simply can't be democratic. It's interesting, right? They talk about the left, they never talk about the right, but it's because the right doesn't exist. But the left definitely exists. And what you get is this diatribe against how democracy is really the best way of government. I agree, by the way. And the only democracy that one should have is pure democracy. And what is pure democracy? And then he goes on to describe liberal democracy. And so the conclusion is the only democracy without adjectives is liberal democracy, which is by definition an adjective, but they can't see it. They've erased it, and so they're blind to it.
Right. I mean, yeah, I guess it's just if you're sort of within the ideology of your own time, it's very hard to see outside of it. Yeah.
And I'm not against, liberal democracy. Hooray, let's have a discussion about its issues, its strengths, its weaknesses, but they literally can't see it, and so you can't have this discussion with them. And so that's the reason for the name of the book. The right doesn't exist, and yet there it is. Because a lot of people would continuously resist this categorization, and yet they'd be very insistent that the left was the worst thing to ever happen to the Mexican government, and that the only way to do government properly was to cut spending, to cut taxes, to cut the government, and to let the free market reign. And they're like, that's not democracy, that's just good sense. That's not right wing, that's just good sense.
Right. How do you think that they would characterize themselves on the political spectrum?
Liberal. They always say they're liberals. Yeah. Well, and this is why it's such an important term in Mexican history, because López Obrador also said he was a liberal. The dictator, the 19th and early 20th dictator, Porfirio Díaz, was also a liberal. The anarchists who went against him were also described as liberals. And so, yeah, it's important to define yourself, because then you just get this word salad where nothing means anything anymore.
Yeah, there's not like a political spectrum. There's a spectrum of which part of liberal are you within, or the whole political spectrum that's getting condensed down to within liberals. Right. Yeah. And then, so of course, after Fox comes Calderón. So the pen has a sort of militaristic shift that, is really what we associate with Mexico now. I mean, the drug war really has sort of absorbed so much of awareness of Mexico from the U.S. Why that shift, and when do people start to realize it's going wrong?
The shift is interesting because, to a certain extent, it was right-wing dogma that led us to the disaster that we saw when it arrived. Felipe Calderón is a very different beast from Vicente Fox. He comes from a different part of the pan, which I think is interesting. Vicente Fox is the newcomers who took over the party, the business people. Felipe Calderón is the old school of the PAN. His dad was in the PAN. He put up posters for the PAN when he was a kid, right? Like, he's way before the business people. And so he's very much a liberal, he's pro, free market to a certain extent, because that's what his party believes. But he's also part of the social side. He is a Catholic. Like, as opposed to Vicente Fox, when everyone's really scared about the Juncker coming to power, really, the man who was far more ideologically Catholic was Felipe Calderón. He kept that to one side because that wasn't his main focus, right? Because he's more of a traditional PAN man. And of course, the issue of the drug war, the issue of the cartels was put before him. It was already starting to kick off during Vicente Fox. And what happens is he gets called by the governor of a state to help him. And he does something that I think is very much right-wing, because it comes from a very deep place within the right-wing dogma, which is the state is the only place, the state is the unchallengeable source of violence in the government. There's no such thing as legitimate revolutions or uprisings, and there's a hierarchy. And if you break that hierarchy, the president has every right to come in as commander-in-chief and crush you. And so ideologically, that makes a lot of sense. And so you send out the greatest armed force in the Mexican territory, which is the armed forces, the army, and they roll in with 6,000 soldiers to fight a war against a non-state actor, which is a drug cartel at the time. And they win. And this is a disaster. People looking at what Donald Trump did in Venezuela will definitely feel this, because there's nothing worse than the wrong strategy doing really well at first, because you double down and you get addicted. It's like you're like a gambler. You get addicted to the feeling of how well it did initially. And he rolls in with the army, and it catches the cartels off guard, because a lot of the work previously had been sort of bad detective work, bad police work, or just letting them do whatever they wanted. This is the state coming in and saying, there's no such thing as non-state actors in the Mexican state. You are within the Mexican state, and you're in a hierarchy within this state, and I am at the top. Here's my boot. And they get the boot, but they don't get the memo. And they push back. And they have access to so much money and so many guns because of the United States. And so they are able to build an equivalent paramilitary army that goes against the state, the Mexican state. And not only that, they start fighting amongst themselves, because once you break up a cartel, they splinter, and you get the Hydra effect, right? You cut off one head and you get three in return. And that's the origin of the Mexican drug war. The drug cartels were in Mexico for years and decades before the drug war started, because the Americans were always there consuming the drugs. The big change was the kicking of the hornet's nest and the creation of this new idea that the way to deal with drug cartels was through armed violence. And that's very much a right-wing approach. Now, what was the previous approach? The previous approach has been corruption, right? It's the one-party state. There is no such thing. It's a very different conception of the state, because a one-party state, the party is also part of the government, and so there's a different hierarchy, and so you can be a sort of like non-state actor that works within the state, and so people work with the cartels, and the government was very corrupt and worked very closely with the cartels. But you had what people call a pax priista, the peace during the peacetime. And then after the PAN governments, you get the Morena governments, which were supposed to be left-wing. And what's incredible to me is a lot of the Mexican opposition and a lot of the foreign press continues to repeat the slogan that López Obrador used a couple of times during the campaign, which is hugs not bullets, abrazos no balazos. He never used that once he got to power. And it's crazy for people to think that that's like his main approach. Now, he was different in that he did believe that killing people wasn't going to solve things, so he really restrained the army, which really destroyed the morale in the army. I don't talk about this in the book, because this, funnily enough, is the left-wing approach to militarism, which is the sort of liberal left-wing, which is, well, let's all try to be friends and deal with the root causes of violence. But once you've opened Pandora's box, the violence is happening despite you, right? And so you had the internal drug wars amongst the drug cartels, vying for power, vying for territory. And so when Claudia Sheinbaum comes to power, she realizes you do actually still need armed violence, simply because that's the modus operandi for the rest of the actors in this thing. But she's doing an interesting thing, I think, which is she's trying to deal with the root causes. I think she's not doing that well with that, to be honest, because it depends on the Mexican economy growing, and it hasn't grown because you need to create the jobs and the space, etc. But what she's done very well, sort of sinisterly, is this new vision of the state, which is a state that is very empowered, very much involved in the fight against crime, but it's not going headfirst, guns a-blazing. It's creating new networks of intelligence and of espionage. And they're going to cut off, I think correctly, what keeps the cartels going, which isn't the drugs per se or even the people, because you can kill as many people as you want, but if they're going to pay a lot of money, you'll get the next poor people who are lining up to join the cartel or being kidnapped to join the cartel. But once you've cut off the money, suddenly I think the cartels do have an issue. And so that's the approach. Literally the biggest news of the past week, very controversial news, is the financial intelligence unit of the Mexican government, which works very closely with the security secretary, can now unilaterally, without a warrant, block someone's bank account, which is a disaster, I think, to a certain extent. It's a big issue, but it's going to make it a lot more effective at clamping down on illicit money flows.
The idea is that it's just going to, as they sort of gather intelligence about who is receiving money, they'll start closing off those channels, and the cartels will not have the money coming in anymore.
And it's interesting because you could argue that she's kept her promise, which is we're going to try and demilitarize the conflict, but it's no longer liberal. And I think that's what's funny. Like, the most liberal response was the least popular response. Turns out Mexicans hate liberalism, because the liberal response was, let's try to stop using the army as much. And people said, screw López Obrador, traitor. And so what people actually want is very illiberal crackdowns on people. It turns out the armed crackdown might not work at 100%. So you do other sorts of pretty problematic crackdowns as well. Telephone espionage, the use of AI to track people, the ability to clamp down and close off people's bank accounts without any other issue but the government's own suspicions of you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, of course, people have like really visceral reactions to the presence of the military and especially to violence in their sort of backyard. So it makes sense that people would really not want that, but it can be as insidious to have these other types of espionage going on.
And I would argue it's still left-wing because ultimately, when it was violence, it was the poor who suffered. The rich can always go to their gated communities or just the United States. Goodbye violence in Mexico, I'll keep making my money in Mexico, extracting all that value, and then taking it off to the US. But if the bank accounts are now the target,
right,
the poor don't care, they've got cash. But who really cares is the people who used to be able to run away with that cash.
Right.
And so
right.
It is left-wing to that extent. It's changed the focus away from the poor and put the onus on the rich, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, but it is the means is the questionable issue.
And it's sort of poking the bear of the people who are already unhappy with Morena.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah. Maybe just to close, can you mentioned, you sort of referenced at the beginning of our call that there were new right-wing actors emerging in Mexico, and in the end of your book you talk about Verástegui, and just maybe can you give us the panorama of how things have been changing since the publication of the book?
So he's lost. I think that's the most important thing that's happened since the book ended. Ricardo Salinas Pliego is a banking, retail, and media mogul. And he is very much against the current government. He was one of the most vociferous voices against the government. And what's interesting is that he was really out there banging the drum to, to beat the government, to kick out Claudia Sheinbaum, worst government ever. The issue was, it didn't matter how much he kicked and screamed. The process under which the process that had started way before Morena came to power in 3 sexennios ago, 3 administrations ago, under the PRI, funnily enough, was an issue with the fact that he hadn't paid his taxes. He claims he has. It seems like he hasn't, but there you are. And so he went through all the stages of grief, right? Denial, bargaining, etc. And I think he's sort of at acceptance now, especially now that he's been hit with the bill, and they have negotiated, which I think is great. It's not great. It's a great. It really reveals something because the government really has a bone to pick with Salinas Pliego they're very happy to see him sink, and a lot of his companies are now in Chapter 21 proceedings. But even then, he got a bit of a tax cut from these back taxes. So he's sort of suddenly become quite a bit more quiet. And not only that, people who are trying to sort of bring his brand over, because he's the most effective political communicator of the opposition in the past, I'd say, 30 years, or 25 years. Fox being the previous one, I'd say. He's sort of gone quiet, and whenever someone tries to win his approval or try to take his image for their own cause, he pushes back quite actively against them. So I wonder if the deal is shut the hell up and you'll get a discount on your tax bill, which I think to a certain extent is a win-win, because I don't think Salinas Pliego wants to be in politics specifically. And I think he wants to. I do think he wants to be a part of politics, but in a far more interesting way, I think, which is the way the church tried to do it, and ineffectively so, which is through education, through non-political means, which I think is the best way for the opposition to be an effective opposition at the moment, because they're so useless in elective office at the moment.
Right. And in terms of the party landscape or sort of emergent organizations that have some political weight, is there anything going on that is interesting for the listeners?
I don't know. What's crazy at the moment is that there is an inkling of an opposition as of the past couple of months, and it's not from the right. It's from within the Morena coalition, the far left party that has always been with López Obrador before Morena existed. They're the ones pushing back against Morena now, because there's corruption, there are interests, there's also legitimate left-wing feeling. And so the left-wing ally, which Morena depends on for its supermajority in Congress, is now pushing back. And
this is
crazy.
PRD, or which?
This is PT, the Labour Party.
PT. Okay,
Partido del
okay,
Trabajo.
Uh-huh.
And the Green Party, which is also an ally, doesn't have a hint of green to it, but it's a very powerful political actor. And they're also Morena's most powerful ally, not the Labour Party, but the Green Party. And they're also pushing back, and they're negotiating because they want their slice of the pie. They want their end of the bargain to be fulfilled. Morena's far more powerful than the two of them, but they need both of them to have the supermajority. By law, in fact, in the Mexican constitution, one single party can't have a supermajority like that. And so it depends on these parties, and so they have way more leverage than the right-wing opposition that is in the opposition at the moment. And so that's where we're at the moment. The new parties, yeah.
It sounds like the thing to watch is whether these parties splinter off from Morena or try to sort of move the needle from within Morena. Yeah,
exactly right. I mean, we'll have the midterms in. I mean, it's actually not that soon, right? But we'll have the midterms, and that might change the scene at the moment. But Claudia Sheinbaum is still very popular. But she needs, as the Constitution stands, she does need allies, and I think that's that forces Morena to do things that maybe even Morena wouldn't want to do, but it forces them to negotiate with these smaller parties that are far more powerful than their sheer numbers would suggest.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Cool. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me. This was very interesting for me and fun to recap everything I read in your book and learn more. So. And that does it for this episode. That was Alex González Ormerod, whose book is La derecha no existe, pero ahí está. This episode was edited by Jose Olivares. If you like what you're hearing, please consider rating us on your favorite podcast platform. It helps other people find the show. And you can check out more of our work at theborderchronicle.com. We have a brand new website, so please come check us out. I'm Caroline Tracey, and this is the Border Chronicle podcast. See you next time.
Because you've always taken such charge.
You are listening
to the Border Chronicle.